So, hello. Welcome to this event. My name is Gunther Peck. I'm the director of the Hart Leadership Program. And we are really delighted you're here tonight. We have a terrific opportunity to think, to reflect, and to engage each other, ideally to organize. The title of this event is Organizing Beyond Elections. And the first half will be a panel discussion, and then we are going to have breakout sessions afterwards. I'm going to turn over briefly to the student organizers who've done such a great job. I do just want to quickly thank two people. Adam Beyer, our associate in research, who's been a grad from last year, who's done a terrific job helping pull this event together, as well as our new associate director of the Hart Leadership Program, Lalita Kalagakla, and who's in the back. And there will be food, just to let you know and remind you. That's coming after the first hour of discussion, and then we will take a brief bit and then have food and breakout groups. Okay? So without further ado, Trey and Gino are going to introduce the panelists.
Hey y'all, thanks for coming out tonight. Like Gunther said, I'm Gino. I'm a junior and I'm studying history here.
Hey everyone, I'm Trey. I'm a senior, also studying history.
Yeah, and we're really excited that y'all are here today. We wanted to share kind of a brief origin and frame the event, and then introduce the panelists. And this event is basically exists because we really love Vann Newkirk through his journalism and through his Twitter, and he was one of the main folks behind putting together the MLK edition of The Atlantic that we both really enjoyed as well. And so over time we've just read his articles more and more. We've really enjoyed his Twitter. We've enjoyed the photos of his son on Twitter a lot too. And at one point last semester, we were we'd really just love to bring Vann here and put him in conversation with folks and see where it would go. I'll give it over, sorry, it's a little loud. Give it over to Trey now for a second.
Yeah, I think another part of that conversation that was happening was this was right after the election had happened, and we were kind of thinking, all right, there's a lot of energy going on right now, and what's going to happen to this once folks get into office and the immediate election has died down. And Vann had been writing a few pieces kind of thinking through some of the elections that have been going on with Stacey Abrams, with Andrew Gillum, with Mike Espy. And so there's a quote that I think kind of gets at the spirit of what we were thinking about. He says, from Alabama to Georgia to Florida and now to Mississippi, and we believe North Carolina, black politicians and voters have told me that they do believe they are building a movement, and that even in losing campaigns, they are building the infrastructure, not just to promote black candidates, but also to ensure that the needs of black communities are met for the first time in decades. And I think the spirit of the event being, what do you do beyond the candidates and actually mobilizing people around issues, and organizing around that even when there's an election present. So we're going to introduce the speakers really quickly, and then we'll turn it over to them.
Awesome. So first is Vann Newkirk. Vann Newkirk is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and policy. In his work, Vann has covered health policy, civil rights, environmental justice, and the role of race and class in American history and the evolution of black identity. Prior to becoming a journalist, he was a health policy analyst, focusing on under-resourced communities, and is from here in North Carolina.
Satana Tiberi was elected Durham's district attorney in 2018. A native of Hamlet, North Carolina, she moved to Durham in 1991 to attend Duke Law School after graduating from Princeton University. She has practiced criminal defense law and served as executive director of the North Carolina Housing Coalition. She has a professional background that has included legal work, finance, and nonprofit management, working with institutions like TROSA and Habitat for Humanity, all in the pursuit of dismantling the systems that restrict the lives of poor people, families, communities of color, and other marginalized and underrepresented groups. Since taking office, she has led a program dismissing old traffic fines and has made bail reform a priority.
Don Taylor is a professor of public policy at Duke University and a founding faculty member of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, among numerous other Duke University affiliations. He currently chairs the Duke University Academic Council and was just named the new director of the Social Science Research Institute at Duke. Most of his ongoing research is in the area of end-of-life policy with a focus on patient decision-making and Medicare policy on hospice and palliative care. He has served on national committees, including National Academies Committee on Healthcare Utilization, and Adults with Disabilities, and the HRSA Negotiated Rulemaking Committee that was created by the Affordable Care Act to reconsider how the federal government identifies health professional shortage areas and medically underserved areas. He's also written about Medicaid expansion and advised elected officials on health policy issues.
Last but not least, my friend Mumbi Kanyogo is a senior majoring in gender, sexuality, feminist studies, and public policy. Over the last 4 years at Duke, she has organized at and beyond the Women's Center to End Sexual Violence, particularly within the Black community at Duke. Most recently, she has been an organizer with People's State of the University, a growing student organizing group, working to use political education, protest, canvassing, and many more strategies to make Duke more livable for students, faculty, and service workers. Elsewhere in Nairobi, her hometown, she has organized with a group called #WeAre52% to petition the government to adhere to its mandate to ensure that women are fairly represented in all branches of the government. She organizes using a queer Black feminist lens, and abolition and transnational solidarity are at the core of her politics. As a scholar, her research is focused on digital feminist movements in East Africa, and after graduating, she will further develop this research in graduate school.
So the rest of the event is going to go. We're going to turn it off over to Vann in just a second. But we're grounding this event in the overall question of what organizing looks like beyond elections, but also grounding it in 3 concrete policy issues of criminal justice reform, healthcare, and gender equity and sexual violence. And so after the conversation, we'll take a brief break for y'all to get food, and then we'll break into 3 discussion groups, facilitated workshops. And we've got some great facilitators, Sonali Mehta, Jenny Zhao, and Spencer Flynn, who are sitting up here in the front, and you can join whichever group based on that core policy area after the discussion. And yeah, I think that's it. We'll turn it over to y'all.
So before I get started, I do want to say at the end of our conversation, when there's about 15 minutes or so left, I do want to get questions from the audience for our 3 amazing panelists. I'll let you know when that happens. First of all, I want to say that I am very excited to be here. I'm a Carolinian, as you said in the introduction. I went to science and math, and so doing well. I used to run through y'all's campus all the time. And I think politically, current events-wise, I said when I got the invite, this is an amazing time to come down and talk politics at Duke. Recently, it got even more of an amazing time when Carolina beat Duke. But I know. Zion's my favorite place, so I'm glad he's healthy. But I got to thinking, it seems to me that every single week, now every single month, it's a good time to come to North Carolina and talk politics to people. And I want to start the conversation by asking our panelists, and we'll start with Mumbi. Right now, the time seems so contentious and also so full of possibility. There's so many new people who are activated, interested in politics. I want to ask you all, where is the energy coming from? And what do you see it doing to people and the understanding of politics in the state and the country?
I think there's two places where this energy is coming from. I think there's the obvious one, which is resistance against the Trump regime. A resistance against the type of bigoted policies that he's pushing, as well as the ways that people's lives have become increasingly precarious over the last 2 years. But at the same time, this regime is not new. It's not unique in that the types of policies that are being put forward are rooted in a history that is far reaching. It goes way beyond this current moment. And so I think that beyond resistance, I think that people are taking this opportunity to think more diligently and more intentionally about the types of futures that they'd like in the world. So I think that there's 2 maneuvers going on right here in terms of resistance, but also just a desire to see a better world than the ones that people already exist in.
You've been an activist for a long time. You've been doing this work. Do you see more students, more people who are around who may have been apolitical in the past, thinking more about politics and activism now in this current climate of Trump's America?
Yeah, I do see people more interested in like activism and organizing. But I think that people are, I think that sometimes it can be a little reactive, right? Like I think that a lot of the backlash can be focusing on a specific thing that Trump has done in the moment without necessarily making connections, like historical connections, but also connections to other things that are happening in the world, right? So at the same time, I think that right now is actually a good time to think about what's going on, because at the same time that, you know, at the same time that there's like a wall like being contemplated on the border, I think there's also something that's going on in Venezuela, where the U.S. is trying to wage some sort of occupation in Venezuela, trying to tamper with elections, well, tamper with the Venezuelan regime in a way that, you know, people are not expected to do. So I'm interested in how people can draw connections between the current political moment that they're living in, as well as the ones that have come before them, as well as things that are happening in the greater world. And I think that those connections are generative or like are less reactive politics, one that's actually rooted in like ideology. And I think that in terms of those, well, when those connections are made, I think that we're less attentive to what we're not only just attentive to what we're fighting against, but we're also attentive to what we want to see in the world.
Don, I want to pose the same question, the first question to you again, which is, we live in this time, in this state, well, you all live in this state, that is currently contentious and at the heart of so many different debates. What do you see it doing to people? Is it activating people? Is it getting more interested in politics? And how is the energy translating, I think, in electoral politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't, as we think about heading to the next presidential election, I don't think since I've been a registered voter I've ever been as undecided about who I was for. But there's so many people in the Democratic primary. I've almost always, for whatever set of reasons, had somebody that I was for, and it has felt appropriate to me, and I've felt like there's been so much of older people or establishment people telling younger people or the activists, oh, if you're too crazy, then we'll lose, or if you push too far, we're going to alienate people, or we have to, you know, it's the whole debate, do you reach out to the white Rust Belt, you know, how progressive should the politics be? And I think those are reasonable questions from an electoral perspective, but actually increasingly feel like I'm not really sure what the answers are. And I feel like that might feel okay. I think young people need to kind of help us figure some of that out, because I think people my age and older, we've kind of broken the country, and you guys need to fix it, or need to fix it, or help us all fix it.
That's cheerful. So Tana, I want to change the question a little bit for you. I imagine when you were running for DA, you were told to wait in some type of way. You come into office in this time when lots of, especially Black and underrepresented candidates are being elected, are finding new electoral energy and ways to be elected. What do you think is the significance of your candidacy and election in this area and in this time?
That's a good question. You know, I ran against an incumbent who was himself Black. And so this is Durham, and we have 80 years of Black political power in this community. So I think what the folks in Durham said is it's not enough to be one thing. It's not enough to say, sure, I'm a Black man, I understand what the system does, but when you're a system actor, if you continue to run the system the same way the system's always been run, your identity has less to do with it. And so nobody told me to wait. If they did, I didn't listen, but what people did say to me, you know, why are you trying to take your brother off? Right? Like, maybe we just need to work with him a little bit and get him to where we need him to be, except I'm already there, so you don't even have to work with me, right? I get to step right in. And so, yeah, so I think it's challenging to I think we want more nuance from our candidates. We want to understand where they stand on a range of issues. And it's just not enough, I think, anymore to be the black candidate or Latino candidate, woman candidate. You really need to understand what's happening.
I want to pose to you the next question since I have you. The theme of this event, we're talking about organizing beyond elections. And I want to know from you as a person who is translated from the community of activism, from people who are advocating for marginalized folks in the area to holding elected office, what are the ways in which you may have built your base of power of organizing that occurred outside of the limelight of the elections? What did you do between years? You didn't just come from nowhere, but I think the story has always kind of painted you as a person who did. So how'd you get there?
Yeah, I didn't come from nowhere. I'll be 50 in 3 weeks, so I've been around a minute. But I think so. I used to always say in my work that I was administrative support for the revolution. I've got a law degree from the law school across the street. I've got an MBA from Fuqua. I'm a pretty, qualified person to do what I do. And I learned early in my career that those were skills that just weren't available in most movements, whether those be, whether that be housing, whether it be criminal justice, and there just weren't people who had a broad range of experience in different things. And so basically I spent the last 25 years of my life really working with activists and movement actors to reach their goals, right? So somebody has to make sure the fax machine is on. Somebody has to make sure the bills are paid. Somebody has to do the constant lobbying, constant policy development. And that's what I did. And it turns out that over that time, I was building a political base. That wasn't the purpose of it. But when some folks came to me now a year and a half ago and asked me to run, it turned out that they had been talking about me doing something for a while. And once I declared I was going to do something, there were all these people who suddenly lined up to help me. I don't think I certainly didn't I didn't say I have all these people out here first, now I'm going to run. But as I ran and the idea caught on, people from kind of all areas of my work showed up. And I showed myself to be reliable and decent and did what I did.
Mumi, I want to pose a similar version of that question to you as a student activist, as a person who is trying to get people involved in politics and thinking about the world beyond elections. What for you are the biggest barriers? What do people care about when it's not Trump? You mentioned, being reactionary against Trump and Trumpism. Are there other things that are in the way and other opportunities there?
I think one of the issues, we're actually talking about this within our people state, our meetings. I think one of the issues is that people like to organize around things that specifically affect them. And when they can't necessarily see the connections between their positionality in the world and the issue that's being negotiated, people sort of check out. So people always want issues that people are organizing around them to be relevant to them. And so I think that with that, it's a very individualized understanding of what organizing is. That it's not just for the individuals, for the community. So that really requires people, the communities that you're part of and even the ones that you're not part of, right? So I really think that requires a selflessness, but then also an analysis that your politics has to go beyond you as an individual and more to what you would like to see for the communities that you inhabit and the ones that you don't. I also think that patience is also another thing. I think that often we like to see results straight away. So we like to see, we like to imagine that organizing yields results straight away. Whereas actually organizing is a lot of the time it's just sitting in rooms and arguing about things. It's about like spending a lot of time like being really intentional about like what are the implications of what we're doing now, not only for us now and for other people in this current political moment, but people in the future. I think the last thing that I would say that's really specific to universities is institutional memory, because we have this 4-year cycle where we're here for 4 years, and then by the end of the 4 years, like, we're gone. And we haven't found, like, I mean, I think there's resources for us to, like, carry on this legacy. Like, Duke has really extensive archives. But I think there's also other resources that we don't necessarily consider. So, for example, Duke has service workers who have been here for generations. So you have people whose parents worked here, whose grandparents worked here, and within those communities, they have a really good analysis of what the university is like, what the university is like in relation to Durham, and how, you know, all those issues play out on campus. And I think that students are like, people talk about the Duke bubble, but there's also like an undergraduate bubble where we simply like organize or like talk amongst ourselves without considering the fact that there are other people who are affected by our actions or a lack of actions. So I think that, yeah, those are like the 3 issues that I think about in terms of
I'm working on an essay that basically traces the political correctness panics that people have on campus, and it happens every 4 years. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Don, we had a conversation out in the hallway about the special reckoning in North Carolina with the monuments and symbols of white supremacy, with the legacy of theft of black land, with all these racial signifiers, racism rather. Do you think the fact that it's taking place alongside all of these different political changes, are those things intricately tied together, and how?
Yeah, I think Duke's place in the South, for many years, a lot of people at Duke have felt ashamed of that, or have felt like it held us back. But actually, I think when we have almost any hot button political or policy issue, be it immigration or health policy or housing or criminal justice reform, either buried in it and whispered or sometimes shouted is race and our historical legacy of race in the United States. And I think Duke has an opportunity to do what I would call reckon with our nation's racial history in a global context. And by that I mean, if we went back over the last few years, we've had a noose hung on campus, the N-word on the Mary Lou, swastika on the bridge, and then we've had a student in a burqa shouted down. Then we've had some international students told that they couldn't speak in their own language on their personal time. And I think that many of us, especially white folks, think of each of those as kind of one-offs. And I think there's a thread through them, and the name of the thread really is white supremacy kind of meets what I would call cultural imperialism. And I think that's actually one of the ways that has worked over many centuries, really, and decades, is that it's always been that group versus the default, that group versus the default. And it just feels like either we will learn to reckon with our history, or it feels like the country's going to explode. And to me, reckoning means telling the truth about the history, and bad history is never by accident. So I'm from Goldsboro, which is 70 miles from Wilmington, and Goldsboro High played New Hanover, Hoggard, and Laney. So a lot of my high school years were spent going down Highway 117 to go play them in football. Okay? And so, of course, in 1898, there's a coup d'etat in Wilmington. And I didn't ever hear about that until I was a professor at Duke. And that's not an accident or a mistake. And so a better telling of the history. And then I think actually reckoning means we have to learn how to talk about it. So one of the worst things about what happened in the biostatistics department is I know some faculty, especially faculty in programs with very large proportion of students who are international students, are fearful about talking about the language issue, like they're scared they're going to stumble, but you know, in fact, we need to be talking about it because the students are fearful and are thinking about it. So if we don't go to where they are, we're failing them and making the problem even worse. And then I think the third part of reckoning is really, I mean, here in Sanford School, Gunther teaches about this. We talk about the use of history in public policy. Like, what reckoning really means is, what does this history mean for us today? And you know, I think the scary thing about a reckoning with our racial history is starting a conversation is really more about an ethic than it is about an outcome. Because I just don't think anybody really knows, you know, what it would look like. Or at least I feel like I don't know what it would look like for sure.
Speaking of the outcomes, I know one of the most measurable and kind of visceral outcomes has been in the realm of criminal justice. And since Black Lives Matter on, we've seen in videos, we've seen in the organizing and protesting, that police and criminal justice treatment of Black folks especially, but poor people, people of color, LGBTQ folks has really gripped people in a way that's changed things. So Tom, I want to ask you, from your vantage now, as the Durham DA, what has changed, and what is the average, I guess, consciousness now of an informed voter on criminal justice issues, and how that changed?
I mean, you cannot talk about criminal justice without talking about race in the United States. The whole framework of criminal justice was created to return slaves to the South. And once you understand that, it makes you have a different imperative about what it means to be safe in our community. Now, most of us grow up with the narrative that the police protect us from the bad guys, that they're the good guys, and that we're all unsafe. Especially white people. Right? White people especially grow up with that narrative. But it turns out that the people that are most unsafe in this country are people who look like me, and Vann, and Moon. And to the extent that the criminal justice system has a customer, it is Black women. Right? Because we're the ones who make bond when men go to jail. We're the ones who keep communities going. We're the ones who are increasingly incarcerated ourselves. And so you have to always have this discussion about race. Now, as a candidate, I had a very broad and damning condemnation of the criminal justice system. I am now 9 weeks into my first term as a judicial attorney. It is one thing to be outside of the system and talk about race. It is a different thing to be inside the system and see that every single case, with very few exceptions, involves Black and brown. District attorney's offices are historically black boxes. They don't do data. And my office is working with Brandon Garrett next door in the law school to start to create some data about who we prosecute and why we prosecute. And our preliminary findings are horrifying. In a community that is about 30% Black, every child that you're prosecuting in our juvenile courts is a Black child. Every single child. And so that can't be right. It can't be right that 100%. Right? So Brandon Garrett is talking to me and he says, this can't be right. Right? But I spent a week in juvenile court and every single day, all I saw were Black kids. Right? So I think the age of social media, we all think, we have kind of a recency bias. We think things only happen to us. And so when you're growing up, Black in America, you think your struggles, to a certain extent, or at least I grew up in an age without social media. Right? I'm a Gen Xer. Are you Gen Xer?
Yes.
So we just,
50's not so bad, don't worry.
right, so we actually, I think we'll go down as probably the only integrated generation in America, right? We all went to school together. We got this kind of narrative that really I couldn't be president of the United States, right? I'm smart, you're talented, you could do that. And like you said, it's not until we get grown up. Right? I can do one better. My grandfather, I went to Wilmington every summer as a kid. My grandfather grew up there. I had never heard of him. Right? And so, so we grew up in this bubble thinking, well, it's me, I'm having trouble, I'm not making good choices. And it's not really you. And that's one of the things that we've seen in the age of social media, and which is why I think when you say that people are more aware, that's it. Because you say, hey, wait a minute. Did you get suspended from school too for something stupid? You can put pieces together.
I want to follow up on what you started off with. I'll leave here and get back on the presidential trail. I will talk to Kamala Harris later this week, I believe. I've been following the kind of criticisms of her candidacy. And of course, there's the critiques of her policy and held in different offices, of her eating chicken or, listening to or not listening to Tupac. But there's also the one I think is the most interesting because of what I think it implies. And it's the fact that she's a prosecutor at all is a demerit against her candidacy for Black people especially. Now, I wanted to ask you what you think of that argument, since you've made the case that there is a rational fear from Black people of the criminal justice system. What do you think of that argument, and what do you say to a person who advances it?
So when a group of community members first came to me and asked me to run for district attorney, I told them no, because I thought prosecutors were lying. I still do. Right? For the most part, I think they lie. I think they cheat. If one of them told me the sky was blue, I would have to walk outside and see myself. I wouldn't even look out the window, because that's, as a criminal defense attorney, that's how little trust I had in the system. And even when I was a criminal defense attorney, after a while, one of the reasons I stopped being a criminal defense attorney was I just never could get good deals for my clients. Now, at the time, I was the only Black woman practicing criminal law in that judicial district. And after a while, I said to my clients, look, if you plan to plead this case, then you need to go talk to your mama, your grandma, get some money, hire a guy who looks like him, because he and the DA play golf. I don't know what they do together because they don't fight me, right? But whatever he's doing with the DA is getting better results than what I do. Right? If you want to try your case, I'm your girl. But they're going to make you sit here for the next 2 years. Now, in Durham County, we had 4 Superior Court judges running 4 felony courtrooms. In that community where I was a criminal defense attorney, we had one once a month. Right? So they were going to make my clients sit there till they did plead, and then about Wednesday they said, well, Your Honor, we don't really have anything that we can try in 2 days. And the judge would go back to wherever the judge came from. And my clients would keep coming back and keep coming back. So, I think there is an argument to be made that prosecution is evil. Now, I see here that you cited Kamala Harris. I don't think so. I mean, I would probably say I'm a bigger fan of Kimberly Fox, right? If I have any issue with Kamala Harris, it's that she's an AKA. That's what but I also understand Kamala Harris and I are in very different political moments. And she was very much, obviously, very much interested in a career beyond the prosecutor's office. And as a young Black woman, I think when she was the district attorney in San Francisco, she might have been 35. I regret a lot of decisions I made. And she was just in a different political atmosphere. And she made choices that advance your career. And anybody that's running for president, including Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, and anybody else who's on somebody's Senate list of presidential candidates or presidents, made those same choices. And so I'm not a big believer in cancel culture because all of us would be canceled. So I think you have to think who, and also I don't think you can be a one-issue voter. I know for a lot of black people, criminal justice reform is their abortion. They don't sway on that matter. But I know people who are good on criminal justice reform and don't understand the politics of finance. And just spout back what they hear about affordable housing. And have no real interest in healthcare or any of those other things. So I think as a voter, you have to look beyond kind of this, well, she put black people in jail and she didn't prosecute police, so I can't vote for her.
Mubi, I want to take the conversation to you. We're talking about prominent black women politicians now, and we're talking about them because that's a moment where there's a record representation, especially among black women, within every single level of government. From your perspective, as a person who is pushing politics to be what you desire it to be, is that representation enough? Are there ways in which you as an activist and other activists can push it to be more than that?
Yeah, it's not enough. Definitely not enough. I think we're like at an interesting moment where like all these like movements are all intersecting. So you have like Me Too intersecting with like BLM and a bunch of other movements. And I think that people have analyzed that as, you know, like the product of identity politics as opposed to like a serious analysis of people's like life conditions, right? So so if we're talking about representational politics as opposed to like people who have like a politics of like actually making people's like lives better and actually listening to people who are voting listening to people who are voting, I think that, sorry, I've lost my okay.
Well, I have a follow-up for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned Me Too, and something that's been on my mind, especially after the Oscars, and there were several people who were the victims of harassment, or assault, who were prominent people on stage. But you know, you get to looking at who's become the face of Me Too, and it's mostly Hollywood, wealthy, white women. And you look at the stats of who tends to be assaulted and who tends to be victimized. It's Black, Latino, immigrant women who don't have the type of power they have. How do you recenter that debate, and what do you think the consequences are of our centering it, this debate on power on women who already have more power than other women?
I think that, especially the Me Too movement, I think a lot of it was about visibility, like who could be seen as like shouting the loudest, or who was seen as like being like a normative or such as like a respectable sort of victim. And so people who are not respectable, so Black women, Latinas, like even sex workers and like working class people who don't have visibility or who don't even have access to the type of like social media following that is required for you to be seen as like a victim. Those people don't necessarily, like you said, like have the access to be seen. So I think that we have to be centered where we're having these conversations. Like, I think there's like a confessional culture on social media where you have to, in order to like have this conversation about sexual assault, you have to sort of like divulge your own experience with sexual assault. So people who don't want to divulge their like sexual assault experiences, especially because it might make their like work life like precarious, or it might be dangerous for them to mention something like that, are already rendered like unseen. So I'm always thinking about what would it look to relocate our conversations to actually like within our communities, like having serious conversations amongst each other. I think that not only means that people can be heard or people can be seen, but I think that it also does something for the type of accountability that we're able to do, right? Because I think that like people who are like in Hollywood, like a lot of the ways that they were thinking about like redressing like sexual violence was through like a punitive like sort of like measure, which was like reporting, like really getting people like fired and stuff like that. But I don't think that it always works like that for survivors. I think that there's different ways that people want to access justice. I don't think that it's always about going to the justice system. So I think that if we're going to have better conversations about sexual violence that are more like expansive and include more people, I think that we really have to relocate where we're having them, and we also have to think more broadly about the goal of those conversations. Like, are we trying to like, what do we define justice at? Are we just defining it around like punishing people who perpetrate violence, or are we also looking at it as a restorative measure for people who've actually experienced that violence?
Last thing on this, how do you conceptualize that within this larger conversation around who has power and what justice means in those frameworks?
Right, so I think, should I call you this?
I think all works.
Like what you were saying about how, like within your own work, like the people who, you know, get to define who like who gets to access justice is really like mediated by like their gender, their race, their access, you know, like their like financial status. And I think that is also similar to like justice, right? Like I think that I'm gonna like think about Duke because this is like a context that we're in. I think that justice has really been like framed around like people who are white, people who are like had like organizations, and so what they imagine is justice, which is like going through like often going through systems in a way that Black people and other people of color don't have access to, and I think that that's become like the dominant thing that people have organized around like sexual violence. And that like erases and unsees like the type of like violent encounters that people of color and Black people have with like these systems. So at the same time that we're being told as Black women to seek justice from like the university, the same university that is often a place where Black people experience like surveillance, have to experience like having to like justify their own existence to be there. The fact that we're being told to look for justice over there and we're not being given other options makes like Black women, other women of color, like super precarious. So I think that I always think about like what would it mean to like have like an intermediary step where we think about like accountability amongst ourselves as a community, as opposed to necessarily looking towards institutions for that type of sort of accountability. Because I think that when we look outside to institutions, we sort of like lay the blame there instead of thinking about the ways that we have created like a community where people are able to be unsafe, right? And it's done through everyday practices. So I think that we just have to think more carefully about what we can do as like communities as opposed to necessarily what we could ask institutions to do for us.
I want everyone in the audience to start thinking about questions. I'm going to come to you for questions in just a little bit, but first I have to scratch my health policy itch with Don, real quick. I, in my past life, was very closely following the Affordable Care Act, policy debate that went into it. You know, it was kind of like drawing blood from a stone, that entire process. You contrast that and the political landscape and the energy that people had then to today, where Medicare for All seems to be on the front burner and something that's possible in a way that seemed almost like a moonshot just 3-4 years ago. What happened?
Yeah, I think in the Affordable Care Act, essentially the Dems negotiated with ourselves. And by that I mean, if you look at a Medicaid expansion and then income-based support about private health insurance, you could go back over time and find bits and bobs of those from more conservative think tanks. And I think basically the Democratic Party decided when they had lots of power, 60 votes in the Senate, that we were going to kick the ball down the field. And basically the answer was what could get 218 votes, what could get 60 votes. And the kind of amalgam, bubblegum, stuck together thing that was the Affordable Care Act, it got 220 votes. So there were 2 to spare in the House. But there weren't 10 votes in the U.S. Senate for Medicare for All in 2000. There weren't 10 votes. So that wasn't going to happen. I think Medicare for All is a better negotiating position than it is an actual health policy for a lot of reasons. Like if the country somehow decided, yeah, let's have Medicare on, there's no magic thing about Medicare for All that would fix all the problems. It could be worked out, but the transition from an employer-based system towards something like that would be profound. And the hardest thing about health policy is the transition period. So if you could construct and control everything and just say, boom, we're going to do this, there are all sorts of things that could be done, including more conservative health policy ideas, but the transitions are super tough. So I personally, I think we need to have universal coverage. So to me, I think universal coverage actually is achievable in part. The Affordable Care Act made that a lot simpler to get to, because basically if every state expanded Medicaid up to 133% of poverty, then you're going to have a safety net up to a certain point for all the good and the bads of that. And the Affordable Care Act exchanges are really tons more stable and robust than I thought they would be, given all the sort of political slings against them. The exchanges have essentially turned into a federally funded high-risk pool, roughly speaking. And from that basis, you can get to universal coverage in some variety of ways. We were talking about this before. When President Trump was able to take over the Republican Party, I think actually I would never say there's nothing that's not possible. I'm being quite serious about that for both parties, because some of the machinations that conservative politicians gave into just to be in power are, in my mind, breathtaking. And so, five years ago, I would have said Medicare for all is completely impossible. I still don't think it's likely to happen, but I just, I don't think I'd rule anything out. But it's a much better negotiating position than negotiating with yourself and hoping you're going to get credit for kind of cutting to the middle, which is what the ACA was. But then that was labeled as so anyway.
Yeah, well, I wanted one very quick follow-up here, which is, this is about organizing beyond elections. If you go back in the history of Medicare and Medicaid, one of the biggest organizing forces was of senior citizens in 1960s because they were dying. It was taking a lot of money to keep people alive longer. From your vantage, what's the source of dissatisfaction today with people who want Medicare for all? What's out there that's driving people to push for it?
I think people want there to be a basic practical answer to what happens if I get sick. And I think, the Affordable Care Act is kludgy, so, and kind of, it's got some complicated bits. And we have this system where most people get insurance from an employer. If you're super poor, you have Medicaid. Once you get old, all of a sudden you have socialized medicine. So the thing that we say, lots of people say they hate in the abstract, once you turn 65, they say we have to protect it. So the politics are super odd. And I think that's because everybody has a grandmother, but everybody doesn't necessarily think about somebody in their family sort of slipping through the cracks, maybe. So I think people just would like for there to be a straightforward answer to, if I get sick or my kid gets sick, is there a reasonably straightforward way for them to get access to health care? So, and Medicare for all, that sounds like something that's pretty straightforward.
Thanks. And now I do want to open up for questions.
So we'll bring the mic to you. If you just want to raise your hand and say, maybe give us your name.
Thanks. My name is Matt, and I just had a quick answer from each one of you. Since this is about organizing, if you could change one thing about whether it's policy at the university or among the student body or at the city level, what would be the policy change or innovation that completely revolutionizes the way people organize? And it doesn't have to be realistic, but as like a, I mean, could you feasibly do it? Don't think about that. But like, what would you do?
I think I would wish there were more institutions that mixed up people of different faiths, incomes, and so people weren't so segmented. I think a lot of us, it's very simple to flee to people who are very similar to us because of kind of the mental burden sometimes of talking across barriers. And so I would wish there were more natural ways for us to know people who are super different from us so we could understand that kind of the human connection between us, and that would help in organizing. If people who are different from us, we understood them more human, it would help us with organizing.
I would go with universal basic income because economic jeopardy prevents things that otherwise might be done. So.
I'd say, but I'd also say that, I mean, like along with the institutional memory thing, I'd like want to create like a tool where people can sort of like get to see step by step what happens, like what like organizing looks like. So I think that people really complicated in their minds and they think of that it's a much harder, or like it's much more, I mean it's hard, but it's much more complicated than it actually is. And I wish there was like a tool, one, to show people, like, I mean, I wish there was a way that we could, and I'm sure, like, I wish there was a way to show people step by step, like, the day of like an like, you know, like what we do in organizing, and I wish there was a way to sort of like, some sort of tool to show people like in the future what it was like to organize now, and yeah.
I actually want to take a quick stab at that because I'm working on a piece on it now. Childcare, universal childcare. And it's, as a parent of a 2-year-old, it would be nice. But also I think, especially young folks tend to underestimate the challenges with getting out and doing anything that's not required if you have children. And the more I've dug into it, the more I realized that the reason why the face of activism is young isn't necessarily because young people are most idealistic, because they tend not to have children.
I'm Eric, I'm from Chicago. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, one of the things I noticed coming to Duke as a current sophomore was, in its own sense, a bubble that sort of magnified the political resentment people had to people of different political views. In organizing, especially being from Chicago, was a very obviously tense time from like 2014 to still today. When you're organizing, how do you guys try to stay off the sort of resentment train? It's really easy to demonize another group or demonize the opposition and to sort of view them in a less than human way in a sense. And and it seems that both sides do it, but how do you guys as organizers and as people who do want to see dialogue, who do want to see change, how do you guys sort of stay off of the mentality of attacking the other person or viewing them in a less than human sense?
I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions.
Oh, go ahead and ask it?
Oh,
Yeah, we're
Oh,
going to take 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, okay. I misunderstood.
So kind of on that whole train of talking to people that you don't really talk like you do or think like you do. Some of the thing I find myself saying a lot at Duke is, sorry, I'm preaching to the choir. Basically, I'm just telling everybody the same thing that they think anyhow. And in this conversation, even between, like, if we're going to say conservative, liberal, a lot of people are not on the same plane of understanding of what's kind of happening. And my concern is about those people who are not even thinking about it, not involved at all, hasn't even crossed their minds. Like, Durham isn't a huge city, but I've lived in cities that are incredibly small, and the politics is not even a question. And I always can't seem to figure out where I take what I've learned here and the things that we discuss here to those places. So what would you think is the way to do that, or how do we overcome that?
Let's take one more question.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is David Dixon. Thank you all for being here. One of the things I heard somebody speak on was just looking at how we're relocating events to some of these communities so that they're more accessible. If we're looking at organizing beyond an election, what does equity look like when you apply that lens to the organizing structure?
Okay, so I'll recap. The first question, we're talking about how do you build bridges between people of different political orientations without demonizing them, and then we talk about how do you get around the preaching to the choir question, and how do you get out to people who may be uninformed, and third is how do we build equity in organizing structures, and you're on the table.
One thing I'll say, my family is deeply politically divided, so I just have a lot of practice at that. So, like, I love my sister, and so my sister and I don't really agree about very many things politically. So, I just live in the tension of that and the reality that we grew up in the same household, and so. The second thing is on that, for whatever reason in my life, I often find myself liking two people who really dislike each other. I don't know exactly why that is, but it may be a personality thing, but I think it's to just try to remember that usually I found when people attack you, there's often some source of pain which they are operating. And I just try to think about that.
First, I'm say, hey, David Dixon. So I would say I'm an advocate and not an activist. And for me, what that means is that I am pushing issues. And I'm to the extent that I have an ideology, which I absolutely do, because you spend any time with me, you will know that I am opinionated as hell. But I try in my work to organize around the issues. And as far as criminal justice reform is concerned, you know, the two biggest funders of, or one of the biggest funders of criminal justice reform right now are the Koch brothers. And I don't know that ideologically we stand for anything the same, but they have an economic model that depends on a whole bunch of low-paid workers, and they can't find low-paid workers if they're in jail. And so they have been dumping funding into finding ways to keep people out of prison. So for me, it's about think that answers both. It's like you organize around the issues and not the ideology. And then you put yourself in situations where you're not speaking to the choir.
Okay, for me, I've been really thinking of like a question, like a way to sort of answer your question in a way that maybe goes in the direction that you're thinking. So organizing with people that you have, with whom you have different like political affiliations. But I can't necessarily find an answer. For me, I don't, like honestly, I don't organize with people who are conservatives because for me, politics isn't necessarily a thing of ideology, it's also a thing about survival. It's also a matter of me existing in this space in a way that, like, a lot of the rhetoric that has been going on of late is not simply like an ideological like disagreement, it's like a fundamental disagreement with people's right to exist in certain spaces. So for me, I love Audre Lorde, like she wrote extensively on it, but like one of the things that she talked about was that you must organize with people across difference. And for me, organizing across difference means that we all have the same objective. Like if we don't have the same objective, then I would not want to organize with you. But the type of difference I'm talking about is like ideological difference maybe, but not like a disagreement about whether people should exist or not. Like that for me is not something that can be organized across. On the matter of like relocating like the conversations that we have, I think it can be very simple things like, for example, like where do you have your meetings? Like there's a lot of disabled folks who cannot like access the buildings where we have these meetings, right? It means that they would like to come, but they can't actually like access the building because like there might be like stairs that are like inaccessible, like there might not be like elevators. So I think it goes to things that are like really small and intentional like that, to like to even things like childcare, like, you know, do you have like the opportunity for people to, you know, have their kids taken care of as they come and organize? Like what time are you having your meetings? Like, is it at a time when people can actually be there? Or is it at a time that's like convenient for you? So yeah, I mean like small intentional things like that in my mind.
Before we take a break, I wanted to just do a quick, I'm just curious about how many of you in the audience consider yourselves organizers? Great. Most of you not. It's interesting. Let me ask you another question, quick follow-up. How many of you in the audience have had a conversation with someone where you've really had to work hard to listen to what they think? Right on. So all of you are organizers, from my advantage. Because organizing, and I think the question of what organizing is actually a really important one, but it begins, I believe, with our ability to listen, sometimes to tough conflicts that we disagree with, because that's how we will be heard. And that maybe is an answer to the question that you raised, Aaron, about like people yelling at each other. That doesn't really organize very well. You might feel good, I told that asshole off, but like, it doesn't actually move the needle of what the justice projects we care about. I just would throw out this will segue nicely before I spend any more time. But someone I really admire who taught me a lot about organizing, his name is Valdemar Velasquez. He's the leader of a farm labor organizing union. And he has a particular kind of vision where his goal is always to open the closed heart. And he's just relentless about it. You know, he'd find a corporate board, he'd be organizing on behalf of guest workers, and his goal would be to open one corporate manager's heart. And if he did that, he considered himself a success. And that is kind of the model that Flock, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, achieved when they persuaded Model Pickle to recognize guest workers in North Carolina. It's the first guest worker union in the South. Crazy progressive change. It's brought a lot of dignity to a lot of people. And how do you do it? Just by speaking from the heart and by listening. So that's how organizing, I think, works for me, and I'm curious as to what you might think about it. We're going to have some food. We really want you to not to leave after the food, but to participate in this next really key part of the conversation, which is to listen to each other in groups about where your passion is, what you really care about, what you're willing to listen with and to people for. So the food's outside, and we're gonna get it and come back in here, okay?
Before we go on break, to give you a sense of where the small group discussions are gonna happen, so in this corner, we'll have the criminal justice folks with Jenny. Jenny, you wanna stand up so they know who you are? Awesome. In the middle, we'll have gender equity and sexual violence folks with Sonali. And then over in this corner, we'll have the healthcare folks with Spencer. And we encourage y'all can we eat in this room? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I would encourage y'all to get food and then come back into the room and get into your spots, and we'll get started right away.
That's right over there.